To save her father's life, she married a complete stranger. But when she finally looked into his eyes, a chilling realization hit. He was the man she had once betrayed. Now fate had bound them together in the most unexpected way. Olivia Evans sat in the dimly lit hospital waiting room, her fingers clenched around the crumpled medical bill in her lap. The overhead fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow, but nothing could dull the despair etched into her tired features. She glanced up at the closed doors leading to the ICU, her heart sinking deeper into her chest. Her father was in there, fighting for his life, and she was utterly helpless. The hospital corridors were silent except for the occasional beeping of monitors and the shuffle of nurses walking past. Olivia's mind raced, going over the same numbers again and again. No matter how many times she calculated, the answer was always the same. She couldn't afford the surgery that could save her father. The doctor's words from earlier still rang in her ears. "The operation needs to be done within the next month, Miss Evans. Without it, his chances of survival are slim. The procedure itself is costly, and with his insurance only covering a small portion, we'll need upfront payment." Upfront payment. She had barely been able to afford the past few months of medication and treatment. Where was she supposed to find this kind of money? Her job as a waitress barely covered rent and food. She had tried everything, taking double shifts, selling what little jewelry she had, even contemplating taking out a loan. But no bank would give money to a woman drowning in debt with no assets. She had no siblings, no extended family willing to help. Her mother had passed away years ago, leaving her and her father to navigate life on their own. He had been her rock, the one person who had always believed in her, sacrificed for her, loved her unconditionally, and now she was on the verge of losing him. The weight of helplessness crushed her. She needed a miracle. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. A message from an unknown number flashed across the screen. "The offer still stands. Meet me tonight if you're ready to save your father's life." Her heart pounded. It was from the mysterious businessman who had approached her 2 days ago with an outrageous proposal: marriage for money. She had thought it was a joke at first, a cruel, ridiculous joke. But as the days passed, as she watched her father deteriorate before her eyes, the idea had slowly taken root in her mind. She had dismissed it before, but now she wasn't so sure. Would she really do this? Marry a stranger for money? It was insane, unthinkable. But so was letting her father die when she had a way to save him. Tears burned in her eyes. She had no other options. Taking a deep breath, she typed a response. "Where should I meet you?" Later that evening, Olivia found herself in front of a sleek black car waiting outside the hospital. A man in a sharp suit stepped out, his face unreadable. "Miss Evans," he greeted her with a nod. "Follow me." She hesitated only for a second before stepping inside the vehicle. The drive was silent. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as Olivia clenched her hands in her lap. She had no idea who she was about to meet, no idea what kind of man would offer marriage like a business deal. She tried to imagine him. A middle-aged businessman, maybe. Someone desperate for a trophy wife to show off at parties, or an eccentric millionaire who wanted a convenient spouse to ward off social pressure. Her mind raced with all the possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. When the car finally pulled up to an extravagant penthouse, her stomach churned. The driver opened the door for her. "This way," the assistant gestured toward the entrance. Olivia stepped into a vast living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the glittering city skyline. The air smelled of expensive cologne, and the furniture was sleek, modern, and minimalistic. Her heartbeat thundered in her chest as she took in the lavish surroundings. And then she saw him. A tall figure stood near the windows, his back to her. He turned around slowly, his sharp, chiseled features illuminated by the city lights. Her breath caught in her throat. It couldn't be. The world tilted beneath her feet as she stared into a pair of familiar blue-gray eyes. Eyes she had once loved. Eyes that had once looked at her with warmth but were now cold and distant. Ethan Carter, her ex-boyfriend. The man she had betrayed years ago. Her knees nearly buckled. He was the one offering her this deal. "You," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. Ethan's lips curled into a smirk, but his eyes remained unreadable. Surprised? Her pulse pounded in her ears. Why would he do this? Why would he offer to marry her? Unless, oh God, this wasn't just a marriage of convenience for him. This was revenge. Memories came rushing back all at once. Ethan had been her first love, the man she had once dreamed of building a future with. But back then, she had been young, reckless, and afraid. She had let her fears and insecurities drive a wedge between them. And when the opportunity had come to choose between him and the future she thought she wanted, she had chosen wrong. She had left him, hurt him, betrayed him. And now, after all these years, he was standing before her with an offer that felt too much like a trap. Ethan leaned against the window, watching her with amusement. "You didn't expect me, did you?" She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "No," she admitted. "I didn't." His gaze flickered to the medical bill clutched in her hands. "Let's not pretend this is a coincidence," he said smoothly. "You need money. I need a wife. Seems like the perfect arrangement." Her fingers tightened around the paper. "But why me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's expression darkened slightly. "Does it matter?" he replied. "You need my help and I'm willing to give it. But everything comes with a price, Olivia." She felt a shiver run down her spine. "And what exactly is your price?" His smirk widened, but there was no humor in his eyes. "You'll find out soon enough." Her stomach twisted with unease. She had walked into this expecting to make a deal with a stranger. Instead, she had walked into the past, a past that Ethan clearly hadn't forgiven her for. And yet, this was her only chance to save her father. Taking a shaky breath, she met his gaze head-on. "Fine," she said. "I'll do it." Ethan pushed off the window, stepping toward her. "Good," he murmured. "Then let's get started." And just like that, Olivia signed away the next 6 months of her life, binding herself to the one man she had never thought she would face again. But as she looked into Ethan's calculating eyes, one thought rang loud and clear in her mind. She had just made a deal with the devil. The weight of her decision pressed down on Olivia like a lead blanket as she sat across from Ethan in his pristine, high-rise office. The expansive glass walls gave a breathtaking view of the city, but she could barely process it. Every nerve in her body was on high alert, and the deafening silence between them only made it worse. Ethan leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled as he watched her with unreadable intensity. He hadn't said much since she agreed to the arrangement, and that was what unsettled her the most. She knew this wasn't just a business deal for him. It was something more, something personal. A contract lay on the polished mahogany desk between them, a contract that would bind her to him for 6 months. "Read it carefully," Ethan said, his voice smooth but firm. "I want you to understand exactly what you're agreeing to." Her throat was dry, her hands trembling slightly as she picked up the papers. As her eyes skimmed over the legal jargon, she swallowed hard at the terms. She would live in his home, attend social events with him, play the role of his doting wife in public. She could not speak to the press or disclose any details of their arrangement. And at the end of the 6 months, she would walk away with $500,000. $500,000. It was more money than she had ever seen in her life, enough to not only cover her father's medical bills, but ensure he received the best care possible. But there was a clause that sent a chill down her spine. No emotional entanglements. Her hands tightened around the pages. Ethan had made it clear this was a transaction, nothing more. He didn't want love, he didn't want reconciliation. He wanted control. "Sign it," he instructed, sliding a sleek pen across the desk toward her. Her fingers hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from him as possible. But she couldn't. Her father's life depended on this. Taking a shaky breath, she gripped the pen and scrawled her name at the bottom. Olivia Evans. The moment she lifted the pen, she felt something inside her shift. It was done. Ethan took the contract, glancing over her signature before placing it neatly into a file. When he looked up at her, his expression was unreadable. "Welcome to your new life, Mrs. Carter." The title made her stomach twist. She had been his once, in a different life, in a different way. But this was nothing like before. "When do we begin?" she asked, forcing her voice to remain steady. Ethan's lips quirked slightly. "Tonight." Her stomach dropped. "So soon." "We're married, Olivia. No point in wasting time. You'll move in immediately." She should have expected that, but hearing it still sent panic coursing through her veins. "I need to pack. You'll have everything you need at my house." He cut her off, standing. "I'll have my driver take you there now." Her protests died in her throat. She had no power in this situation. She had already sold herself to him. So she nodded. And just like that, her life as Ethan Carter's wife began. The mansion was nothing short of breathtaking. As the car pulled through towering iron gates and onto the long, winding driveway, Olivia felt like she was stepping into a completely different world. The estate was massive, a masterpiece of glass and stone, sprawling over acres of perfectly manicured land. The staff was already lined up at the entrance when the car stopped. A butler opened the door for her, bowing slightly. "Welcome, ma'am." She didn't know how to respond. As she stepped inside, the sheer grandeur of the place overwhelmed her. The ceiling stretched endlessly, crystal chandeliers illuminating the pristine marble floors. A grand staircase spiraled up to the second level, its railing adorned with intricate gold designs. It was the kind of home people dreamed of, but to her it felt like a cage. "This will be your room." Ethan's voice snapped her back to reality. She turned to find him standing near an open doorway, his posture relaxed, but his gaze sharp. He led her inside a spacious bedroom that was easily the size of her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in natural light, while the king-sized bed, draped in white silk, sat at the center. "This is—" she trailed off, unsure of what to say. "Temporary," Ethan finished for her. "You'll stay here, my room is down the hall." So they wouldn't be sharing a bed. That should have relieved her. Instead, it only deepened the unease settling in her chest. She set her small bag on the bed, feeling completely out of place. "Olivia." She turned to face him. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes she couldn't decipher. "We have an event tomorrow night," he informed her. "A gala. You'll need to look the part." Her stomach tightened. "A gala. You're my wife now," he reminded her, "and the world will expect to see us together." She exhaled slowly, nodding. "I understand." His gaze lingered on her for a moment before he turned to leave. "Ethan," she called before she could stop herself. He paused, his back still to her. She hesitated before speaking. "Why did you choose me?" The question hung in the air. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice laced with something unreadable, he replied, "Because you owe me." And then he was gone, leaving Olivia standing in the middle of her new gilded prison. Her heart pounded against her ribs. "Because you owe me." The weight of those words settled heavily in her chest. Ethan Carter wasn't just marrying her for convenience. This was something else and something personal, and she had no idea just how much she was about to lose. The morning of the gala was a blur of preparations. Olivia barely had time to process the magnitude of her new reality before she was thrust into the whirlwind of Ethan's world. A team of stylists arrived at the mansion before sunrise. She sat still as they worked on her, curling her hair into soft waves, applying flawless makeup, and dressing her in an evening gown that looked like something out of a fairy tale. The gown was deep crimson, its fabric flowing like liquid silk over her body. It clung in all the right places, making her feel exposed and vulnerable under its weight. The neckline was lower than anything she'd ever worn, and the diamond necklace resting on her collarbone made her feel even more like a stranger to herself. She barely recognized the woman in the mirror. "This will do," Ethan's voice cut through her thoughts. She turned to see him standing in the doorway, dressed in a sleek black tuxedo, every inch the powerful billionaire that the world adored. His gaze swept over her, assessing. He gave nothing away. "You clean up well," he remarked. "So do you," she countered, though the words felt hollow. Ethan smirked but said nothing more. A car was waiting for them outside, a sleek black limousine that exuded wealth and status. The ride to the gala was quiet, the tension between them palpable. As they neared the venue, Olivia turned to him. "What exactly do you expect from me tonight?" He finally met her gaze. "Smile, be the perfect wife, and don't embarrass me." She swallowed hard, nodding. The car pulled up to the grand entrance of the ballroom, cameras flashing the second the doors opened. Ethan stepped out first, turning to offer her his hand. She hesitated before placing her fingers in his, the warmth of his skin sending an unexpected jolt through her. As they stepped onto the red carpet, the noise of the crowd was deafening. "Mr. Carter, over here!" "Ethan, is this your wife?" "Olivia, how does it feel to be married to one of the most powerful men in the country?" The questions came rapid fire, but she kept her expression poised, her smile practiced. Ethan's grip on her waist was firm as he guided her through the flashing lights, his presence commanding. The moment they entered the ballroom, the world inside shifted. It was a sea of elegance. Crystal chandeliers casting golden light over the elite of high society. Women in designer gowns, men in perfectly tailored suits, glasses of champagne glimmering in the hands of the privileged. Olivia felt suffocated. "You're doing fine," Ethan murmured in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. She forced a nod, keeping up the charade. People flocked to Ethan instantly, eager to speak with him. He introduced her as his wife, the word foreign every time he said it, but she played her part, smiling when necessary, nodding at the right moments. But then, well, Ethan Carter, I must say I wasn't expecting this." A familiar voice made Olivia stiffen. She turned to see a woman with striking features, dark red lips curled into a smirk. Her dress was scandalously elegant, clinging to her curves in a way that demanded attention. Sophia, Ethan's former fiancée, and Olivia's greatest nightmare. "Sophia," Ethan greeted smoothly, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't expecting to see you tonight." She let out a soft laugh, her sharp eyes flicking to Olivia. "Neither was I, to be honest. I must say, your wife is surprising." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Olivia forced a polite smile. "It's nice to meet you." Sophia's gaze flickered with amusement, as if she was toying with a new plaything. "Tell me, Olivia, how does it feel to be married to Ethan?" The question was laced with hidden meaning. Ethan's fingers tightened around Olivia's waist, a silent warning. She met Sophia's gaze head-on, refusing to falter. "Every day is an adventure." Sophia's smirk deepened, but she didn't press further. "I'll be watching," she murmured before gliding away, leaving Olivia rattled. Ethan exhaled slowly. "Ignore her." "She hates me," Olivia whispered. "She hates everyone," he corrected. But Olivia knew it was more than that. Sophia wasn't just a woman from Ethan's past. She was a threat. And Olivia had the sinking feeling that this game had only just begun. As the night progressed, Olivia played her part flawlessly. She smiled when necessary, engaged in small talk with strangers who saw her as nothing more than Ethan Carter's latest acquisition, and laughed at jokes she barely registered. But the weight of Sophia's presence lingered like an unwelcome shadow. Every so often, Olivia felt the woman's gaze burning into her from across the room. Sophia had been engaged to Ethan once, and while their relationship had ended long before Olivia came into the picture, the possessiveness in Sophia's eyes was unmistakable. She was watching, waiting for Olivia to slip. "Are you all right?" Ethan murmured beside her as they made their rounds through the ballroom. "Just peachy," Olivia replied through a strained smile, accepting another flute of champagne from a passing waiter. Ethan studied her for a moment, his gaze sharp. "Don't let her get to you." "I'm not," Olivia lied. Ethan smirked. "Liar." She shot him a glare but said nothing more. Just as Olivia thought she might finally get a moment of reprieve, a familiar voice cut through the chatter. "Ethan, old friend, it's been too long." A man approached, flanked by two other sharply dressed individuals. His expensive suit fit him like a second skin, his confidence nearly suffocating. Olivia didn't recognize him, but the way Ethan's posture stiffened told her everything she needed to know. "James," Ethan greeted smoothly, though his tone had an edge. James glanced at Olivia, his gaze lingering just a second too long. "And who is this lovely creature?" Ethan's grip on her waist tightened. "My wife, Olivia." James's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise. "Ah, so the rumors were true. You finally settled down. How unexpected." Olivia smiled tightly. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. James Adler," he supplied, taking her hand and brushing his lips over her knuckles. "Though Ethan and I go way back, don't we?" Ethan's expression didn't change, but Olivia could feel the tension rolling off him in waves. "You could say that," Ethan replied coolly. James chuckled, turning his attention back to Olivia. "And tell me, Olivia, how did you manage to tame our dear Ethan? He was never one for—" "That's enough," Ethan cut in, his tone sharp. James smirked. "Touchy, aren't we?" Olivia sensed there was history here, one she didn't fully understand. "Well," James continued, swirling the whiskey in his glass, "it'll be interesting to see how long this little arrangement of yours lasts." Olivia's stomach dropped. Ethan's expression turned to stone. "Watch yourself, James." James simply laughed. "Relax, old friend, I was only teasing." But Olivia knew better. James knew something. and from the smug look on his face, Olivia suspected it wouldn't be long before he used it to his advantage. As James walked away, Olivia turned to Ethan. What was that about? Ethan exhaled slowly. Nothing you need to worry about. Don't do that, Olivia said, lowering her voice. Don't shut me out. Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. James and I have a complicated past, he admitted. He's not someone you can trust. Neither are you, Olivia pointed out. Ethan's lips curled into a smirk. Touché. Before Olivia could respond, the orchestra struck up a new tune, signaling the start of the evening's first dance. Ethan extended his hand. Dance with me. She hesitated. Olivia, he said, his voice softer than before. Just trust me. Reluctantly, she placed her hand in his. The moment he pulled her onto the dance floor, the rest of the world melted away. His hand rested against the small of her back, his movements effortless as he led her through the steps. You're a good dancer, Olivia murmured, caught off guard by how natural it felt. Ethan's smirk returned. There's a lot you don't know about me. She lifted her chin. Then maybe you should start telling me. For a brief moment, something flickered in Ethan's gaze. Something real. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. You wouldn't believe me if I did. Before she could press further, a voice interrupted. Mind if I cut in? Olivia turned, only to find James Adler standing at the edge of the dance floor, his smirk still firmly in place. Ethan's jaw clenched. And Olivia knew, without a doubt, this night was far from over. James's smirk widened as he extended his hand toward Olivia, eyes glinting with amusement. The tension between him and Ethan was palpable, and Olivia felt like a pawn caught between two kings locked in a silent war. Ethan didn't move. He kept his hand firmly on her waist, his grip tightening just slightly, a silent message that he wasn't going to let her go. But Olivia, sensing an opportunity, gave him a challenging look. If my husband has no objections, of course, she said smoothly, turning her head toward Ethan with an expectant gaze. Ethan's jaw tensed. James chuckled. Well, there was a battle raging in Ethan's eyes, but after a long pause, he exhaled and stepped back. Don't be long. It wasn't a request, it was a warning. James took Olivia's hand, guiding her into the next dance as Ethan stormed off the dance floor, clearly fuming. So tell me, James mused as he twirled her effortlessly, is this marriage of yours real, or just another well-orchestrated Carter scheme? Olivia's breath hitched. He knew. She kept her composure, forcing a laugh. That's a bold accusation, Mr. Adler. James, he corrected with a smile. And it's not an accusation, sweetheart. It's a fact. Olivia met his gaze, keeping her expression unreadable. You seem awfully interested in my marriage, James. James's eyes darkened with amusement. That's because I know your husband better than you do. And trust me, sweetheart, Ethan Carter doesn't fall in love. Her heart skipped a beat, but she kept her face neutral. What makes you think he hasn't changed? She challenged. James leaned in, his lips barely an inch from her ear. Because men like Ethan don't change. They only manipulate better. Olivia swallowed. Why are you telling me this? She whispered. James smirked. Let's just say I like shaking things up, and you, my dear, are the perfect storm. The song ended and James released her with a knowing smile. Enjoy the rest of your night, Mrs. Carter, he said smoothly before walking away. Olivia stood frozen, her pulse pounding. She needed to find Ethan. Now, she found him at the bar, his fingers wrapped tightly around a crystal glass of whiskey, jaw clenched as he stared at the amber liquid. Enjoyed yourself? He asked without looking at her. Cut the act, Ethan, Olivia snapped, stepping closer. James knows. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. Of course he does. You knew? Olivia hissed. Ethan finally turned to her, his expression unreadable. James has been trying to get leverage over me for years. He's just waiting for the right moment to use it. Olivia exhaled sharply. And you weren't planning on telling me this. Why? Ethan's eyes darkened. Because I can handle James. That's not the point, Olivia pressed. If he exposes us, he won't, Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. And how can you be so sure? Ethan set his drink down with a loud clink, then stepped in close, his presence overwhelming. Because I don't lose, Olivia, he murmured, his voice low and commanding. A shiver ran down her spine, but before she could respond, the lights in the ballroom suddenly flickered. Then the entire room went dark. A hush fell over the crowd, followed by hushed murmurs of confusion. Ethan's hand instantly found Olivia's wrist. "Stay close," he ordered. A second later, a deep voice rang through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you're enjoying the evening, but now it's time for the real entertainment." A large screen at the front of the ballroom lit up, and then a video started playing. Olivia felt her blood turn to ice, because on that screen, in front of hundreds of guests, was footage of their contract signing. A clip of her and Ethan sitting across from each other in his office, exchanging papers, proof that their marriage was nothing more than a lie. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone had leaked the truth, and Olivia's worst nightmare had just begun. A heavy silence fell over the grand ballroom as the video continued playing, exposing the very contract Olivia and Ethan had fought so hard to keep hidden. Every signed clause, every coldly negotiated term, everything was out in the open for the entire high society to see. Olivia could feel her heart pounding in her chest as whispers rippled through the guests. A contract? So it was never real. I knew it. She was just after his money. Ethan Carter, the man who never loved, bought himself a wife. Humiliation crawled up Olivia's spine like ice-cold fingers. She wanted to run, to disappear, to pretend this wasn't happening, but she stood frozen, unable to look away from the screen. Ethan, however, was already moving. With one swift motion, he grabbed Olivia's wrist and pulled her close. His grip was tight, his entire body radiating fury. "Who did this?" he growled under his breath. Olivia's throat tightened. She had no idea. But then, a slow, deliberate clap echoed through the room. James Adler. He stepped forward, the smirk on his face smug and triumphant. "Quite the interesting turn of events, don't you think?" he mused, his voice dripping with amusement. "Ethan Carter, the ruthless businessman, actually had to buy himself a wife? And here I thought you were untouchable." Ethan's entire body tensed like a predator ready to strike. "You did this!" he accused, voice low and lethal. James shrugged. "I simply provided the truth. What happens next? Well, that's up to the audience." Olivia's stomach twisted as the murmurs grew louder. Eyes bore into her, judging, accusing. She turned toward Ethan, panic in her voice. "Ethan, we have to leave." But before she could take a step, James held up a hand. "Not so fast," he said smoothly. "Tell me, Olivia, how does it feel, knowing that everyone now sees you for what you truly are?" Her blood ran cold. "You don't know anything about me," she shot back. James chuckled. "Oh, but I do. You signed that contract willingly, didn't you?" Olivia's jaw clenched. "You sold yourself to him for money," he continued, eyes gleaming with cruelty. "Tell me, was it worth it?" Ethan had heard enough. Without warning, he lunged at James, grabbing him by the collar. "If you think I won't destroy you for this," James simply laughed. "Go ahead, hit me. Prove to everyone just how desperate you are." Ethan's fists trembled, his body rigid with rage. But Olivia knew this was exactly what James wanted. "Ethan," she whispered urgently, "stop." For a moment it seemed like he wouldn't listen. His jaw was clenched, his grip iron tight. But then, slowly, he released James and took a step back. James smirked. Smart choice. Then he turned to the crowd and raised his voice. "Tell me, dear guests, what do you think? Does a woman who marries for money deserve the Carter Empire?" A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Olivia's stomach twisted. James leaned in closer, his voice a whisper only she could hear. "Leave him," he murmured. "Walk away and I'll make sure you never suffer another day in your life." She froze. He was giving her an escape, a chance to end this nightmare. But Olivia knew better. James didn't offer favors, and she wasn't about to become his next pawn. Squaring her shoulders, she lifted her chin and met his gaze head-on. "You can keep your offer, James," she said coldly, "because I'd rather suffer with Ethan than ever owe you anything." James's smirk faltered. And Ethan. For the first time that night, Olivia saw something flicker in his eyes. Not just anger, not just frustration, but something deeper, something real. His hand reached for hers, and without hesitation she took it. Together they turned and walked out of the ballroom, leaving James standing in their wake. The night wasn't over. The battle wasn't won. But for the first time, Olivia and Ethan were truly on the same side, and that changed everything. The following days passed in a blur. Ethan was nowhere to be found. Olivia had searched the estate, reached out to his assistant, even called his office, only to be told that Mr. Carter was unavailable. She knew what that meant. He was avoiding her, avoiding the chaos that had exploded at the gala, avoiding the truth of their arrangement, avoiding her. Olivia sat alone in their grand bedroom, staring at the empty side of the bed where Ethan had once laid beside her. She had grown used to his presence, to the quiet moments they shared before sleep, to the warmth of him even when he barely spoke. Now there was only cold emptiness. Her phone vibrated beside her, pulling her out of her thoughts. James Adler. Her stomach churned. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Olivia. James's voice was smug, laced with satisfaction. I trust you've had time to process your little public humiliation. Her grip on the phone tightened. What do you want? She asked, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. James chuckled. Oh, you already know. Your father's company is on the brink of collapse, and now that Ethan's little contract marriage is out in the open, his reputation is taking a hit as well. Investors don't trust a man who lies about his personal life. He'll have no choice but to distance himself from you. Olivia's pulse pounded. What are you saying? I'm saying, James drawled, that the offer still stands. Leave Ethan, for good this time. Walk away, and I'll make sure your father's debts disappear. A bitter laugh escaped Olivia's lips. You think I would betray Ethan like that? James let out a hum of amusement. Betray him? He's already shutting you out, isn't he? You were never his equal, Olivia. Just a pawn in his game. Now that you've lost your usefulness, he won't fight for you. Her stomach twisted. Was he right? Had Ethan already decided to cut ties? She had seen the way he had walked out that night, the way his eyes had been void of the warmth they had once held for her. I'll give you 24 hours, James said, his voice smooth like poison. Make the right choice. The call ended. Olivia gripped the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She wouldn't let James win. Not like this. With renewed determination, she stood, grabbed her coat, and walked out of the estate. She was going to find Ethan, and she was going to fight for him. The rain poured heavily by the time she arrived at Ethan's office. She had barely stepped inside before his assistant, Claire, blocked her path. Mrs. Carter, Where is he? Olivia demanded. Claire hesitated before sighing. He's in his private lounge, but… Olivia didn't wait. She marched past Claire, down the hallway until she reached a familiar door. Without knocking, she pushed it open. Ethan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His back was to her, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his grip tightened around the glass. He didn't turn around. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice cold. Olivia took a step forward. We need to talk. There's nothing left to say. Her heart clenched. Ethan, please, she whispered. At that, he finally turned, his expression unreadable. You knew this was temporary, he said. The contract. Screw the contract, she snapped, surprising even herself. This isn't about business anymore. This is about us. A flicker of something, pain, regret, crossed his face before it vanished. There is no us, Olivia. Silence stretched between them. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, Did you ever care about me at all? Ethan exhaled sharply, setting his glass down. He stopped, his hands clenching at his sides. I don't know. Her chest tightened. That wasn't the answer she had been hoping for. She turned away, swallowing back the lump in her throat. I guess that's my answer. She started toward the door, but before she could reach it, Ethan's hand caught her wrist. His grip was firm but not forceful. Olivia. His voice was low, rough, filled with something she couldn't quite place. She turned, looking up into his conflicted gaze. For the first time, she saw the cracks in his cold exterior. He wasn't just shutting her out. He was scared. Scared of what they had become. Scared of how much she had started to mean to him. And for the first time in her life, Olivia decided she wasn't going to let fear dictate her choices. She reached up, cupping his face gently. I love you, she whispered. Ethan inhaled sharply, his eyes searching hers. Then, he kissed her. Not out of obligation, not because of a contract, but because, despite everything, he couldn't deny it any longer. He loved her too. The moment Ethan's lips met Olivia's, something inside him shattered. For weeks he had built walls around himself, convinced that pushing her away was the best solution, that if he let her go, it would protect them both from the chaos their marriage had become. But standing here, feeling her warmth, the softness of her touch, he realized he didn't want to let her go. Olivia's fingers tightened around the lapels of his suit, pulling him closer, as if she feared he would slip away. The desperation in her kiss told him everything he needed to know. She had never stopped fighting for him. So why had he? Why had he been so afraid to accept what was right in front of him? Ethan broke the kiss first, but only by a fraction. Their breaths mingled in the small space between them, both of their hearts hammering against their chests. "I love you," Olivia repeated, her voice trembling yet firm. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. Those words, so simple, so pure, cut through all the noise in his head. But before he could say them back, before he could even fully process what had just happened, a loud knock shattered the moment. Ethan pulled away abruptly, his expression hardening as he turned toward the door. Claire, his assistant, hesitated at the threshold. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said, her gaze flickering between them. "But Mr. Adler is here." The name sent a wave of rage through Ethan. James Adler, he had been waiting for this. Ethan turned back to Olivia, his voice low but filled with meaning. "Stay here." She shook her head. "Number whatever this is, I want to face it with you." Ethan hesitated but ultimately nodded. If James was here to play dirty, then Olivia deserved to see for herself just how deep the deception went. They walked out together side by side, like a united front. And when they stepped into Ethan's office, James Adler was waiting for them. He sat casually in one of the chairs, a smug grin stretching across his face. "Ethan," he greeted smoothly, like they were old friends. His gaze flickered to Olivia, and the smirk widened. "Ah, and the lovely Mrs. Carter. How touching." Ethan didn't sit. He didn't offer James a drink or pretend to engage in pleasantries. Instead, he folded his arms and cut straight to the point. "What do you want?" James leaned back, his posture relaxed, but there was malice in his eyes. "I assume you're aware that your little contract marriage has become quite the public scandal." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. James chuckled. "Investors are getting nervous, Ethan. Your board is considering stepping in, and given everything that's happened, well, let's just say they might be more inclined to side with me." Olivia tensed beside Ethan. "Side with you?" she echoed. "What are you talking about?" James turned his smug grin toward her. "Oh, Olivia," he said mockingly. "You didn't think I was just some forgotten ex, did you? I've been planning this for years. Ethan's empire is built on stability, on trust, and thanks to your little scandal, that trust is crumbling." Ethan clenched his fists. "You want my company?" James tilted his head. "I want what's rightfully mine, and I'm offering you a choice, Ethan. Step down voluntarily and I'll make sure this transition is smooth. If not..." He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the desk. Ethan didn't reach for it. Instead, Olivia grabbed it first. She opened it, and her blood ran cold. Inside were documents, photos, even video clips, all strategically compiled evidence painting Olivia as a manipulative gold digger who had orchestrated the contract marriage for financial gain. James had manufactured an entire narrative, twisting the truth into something grotesque. "You," Olivia's voice was barely a whisper, "you set this up." James smiled. "Perception is everything, sweetheart." Ethan snatched the folder from her hands, flipping through it with growing fury. "You think blackmailing me is going to work?" he growled. "You underestimate me, James." James stood, straightening his cuffs. "We'll see about that." He turned to Olivia one last time, his smirk never fading. "You have until tomorrow," he said. "After that, everything you love will be destroyed." Then he walked out, leaving only silence in his wake. Olivia felt a chill run down her spine. Ethan slowly closed the folder and set it on the desk, his face unreadable. "I won't let him win," she whispered. Ethan looked at her, his gaze intense. "Neither will I." And for the first time, Olivia saw something in him she hadn't before. Not just love, but a man willing to fight for that love no matter the cost. Ethan's entire body was tense as he stood in his office, staring at the folder James had left behind. His grip on the edge of the desk tightened, his mind racing through every possible scenario. James thought he had them cornered, but Ethan had spent his entire life building an empire, not by playing fair, but by being smarter than those who wanted to see him fall. Olivia placed a trembling hand on his arm. "We can fight this," she whispered. "Together." Ethan turned to her, his gaze searching hers. This woman, his wife, even if only by contract, had been through so much because of him. She had endured his coldness, his mistrust, his cruel attempts to push her away. Yet she stood here, unwavering. For the first time in a long time, he realized, Olivia wasn't just someone from his past. She was his future. Ethan exhaled deeply and nodded. Then let's bring James Adler to his knees. They didn't have much time. By morning, James would release the fabricated evidence, and the board would demand Ethan's resignation. His investors would panic, stocks would plummet, and everything he had worked for would be ripped from him, unless they turned the tables first. Ethan picked up his phone. Claire, get a team together. I want every piece of dirt on James Adler by sunrise. Claire, ever efficient, simply replied, already on it. Ethan hung up and turned to Olivia. We need to fight fire with fire. Olivia squared her shoulders. What do you need me to do? A flicker of admiration crossed Ethan's face. You're not afraid. She gave him a small, determined smile. I lost you once, Ethan. I won't lose you again. And just like that, they became a team. The plan begins. While Ethan's people worked through the night, Olivia went to work as well. She knew James better than anyone. If he had gone this far, there had to be more skeletons in his closet. With Ethan's resources, she dug through years of records, financial statements, business dealings, and old personal connections. It didn't take long to find something damning. A trail of fraudulent deals, offshore accounts, and most importantly, proof that James had been manipulating not just Ethan's company, but multiple corporations over the years. By the time morning came, Olivia and Ethan had compiled everything they needed. Now it was time to strike back. The showdown. Ethan had called an emergency press conference. James thought he would be the one to expose Olivia, to humiliate her in front of the world. But he didn't know that Ethan had already beaten him to it. As the cameras flashed, journalists leaned forward in anticipation. Ethan stepped up to the podium, Olivia by his side. His presence was powerful, commanding, exuding the confidence of a man who refused to be controlled. I know why you're all here today, Ethan began, his voice steady. Certain allegations about my wife and my marriage have surfaced. I could stand here and deny them, but instead, I'd like to share the truth. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Ethan gestured toward the massive screen behind him. The room fell silent as documents, images, and video clips appeared on the screen. Proof of James Adler's corruption. One by one, Ethan exposed how James had fabricated evidence against Olivia, how he had attempted to take over Carter Enterprises through illegal means, and worst of all, how he had been secretly embezzling money for years. The final blow came when Ethan played an audio recording. James, arrogantly bragging about how he was going to destroy Ethan's reputation. Gasps echoed through the room. Journalists whispered amongst themselves. Investors exchanged shocked glances. James, standing in the back of the room, turned ghostly pale. Olivia stepped forward then, her voice ringing with clarity. For years, James Adler has used deceit and manipulation to ruin lives, she said, her gaze locking onto James. But today, the truth wins. Security moved in before James could escape. The moment the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Olivia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Justice had finally been served. Love wins. The conference was over. Ethan and Olivia stood in the quiet of his office, the adrenaline of the battle still rushing through them. We did it, Olivia whispered. Ethan turned to her, his expression unreadable. We did. For a moment, silence stretched between them. Then, with slow deliberation, Ethan reached out, cupping her face in his hands. I don't care about contracts. I don't care about deals. I care about you. His voice was hoarse, filled with raw emotion. Olivia's breath hitched. This was never fake for me, she admitted, her voice shaking. Ethan's lips curled into a soft smile. Then let's make it real. And when he kissed her, it wasn't a kiss of obligation or pretense. It was a kiss of love, a kiss that promised a new beginning, a kiss that sealed their fate, together, forever. The end. Like this story? Let us know in the comments. Subscribe for more heartwarming, dramatic stories filled with love, redemption, and unexpected twists. Unexpected twists. Unexpected twists.